You're very self-deprecating about your acting. Is that defensive?
Yes, it's defensive. I always try to say it before anybody else does.
But if you didn't say it, perhaps nobody else would.
I never thought of that. Maybe I started the wrong way.
Roger Moore was, and is still to this day, my favourite James Bond, and the man was the greatest ambassador for the 007 series that a fan could ask for. He would never shy away from delivering witty and humorous anecdotes on Bond-related retrospectives and documentaries. He published a number of books during his lifetime talking about his time as the secret agent specifically. He also took part in audio commentaries for the DVD Blu-ray releases of all 7 of his Bond films, and indeed, this all extends beyond Bond 2. The man had many roles throughout a storied career and an amazing life, much of which has been chronicled in publications and a plethora of interviews on TV and in print, and as a variety of DVD extras. There was seemingly no film the man would shy away from talking about. And I should know, I own the DVD for Bullseye, which of course features an interview of Sir Roger Moore talking about making this absolute abomination of a film.
Michael Caine made a statement that we had more fun making it than the audience did watching it. I hope you don't feel the same. If you do, don't tell anybody.
Good evening, Mr. Moore fans. The point that I'm trying to make here is that if you are as immersed in the world of Bond, and by extension Sir Roger, as I am, there probably isn't much more that you ever thought you could learn about the guy. Which is why I was somewhat nonplussed, I guess, by news that there was to be a brand new 2024 produced documentary charting the life of the actor. Don't get me wrong, I'm all in for celebrating the memory of the great man and actor, but this film had a cinema release in the UK. It was broadcast on BBC Two on Christmas Day, and yet it took me a little while into 2025 to get around to watching it, because I mean, frankly, I've read Sir Roger's books, I've seen so many of his interviews, I've seen entire documentaries about the man's life before, so in and amongst all of the typical December and Christmas and New Year's scrambling, I just didn't feel terribly driven to see this as a matter of urgency. I just kind of figured it'd be a lot of talking heads, like just talking about how wonderful Roger is, and don't get me wrong, there's a fair amount of that in the documentary, as you'd expect for a man that was as beloved as Roger, but I started seeing posts and friends started like saying things to me like, what the hell was that voiceover narration about? And I can't believe that they actually read out that letter in the film, and so there was enough conversation going on about it that I was intrigued, and I figured, you know what, I probably need to check this out quite quickly. From Roger Moore with Love is around 80 minutes long and presents a broad, glossy look at the life of the actor. His children are interviewed along with friends and fellow actors including Christopher Walken, Joan Collins, Jane Seymour, and Pierce Brosnan. It's a really amazing set of interviewees, in all honesty, that they were able to assemble for the film, and I must say, they're a big draw for somebody like me because, well, frankly, it's not often that you hear the likes of Steven Berkoff just talking quite candidly about Roger, and indeed Christopher Walken even mentions at one point that he doesn't even really like doing these kinds of interviews, talking about fellow actors and such, but Roger was just such a wonderful man that he was more than happy to give up his time to sing the man's praises and tell a few stories. Pierce Brosnan tells a lovely anecdote about seeing Roger Moore when he was a kid and going up to him and asking for his autograph, which I thought was really nice to hear. I know obviously that the two had met while Roger was alive multiple times, in fact, but I had no idea that Brosnan was such a fan to that extent that, you know, as a kid he would approach him and ask for an autograph. As a Bond fan that has been in that same situation, it really warmed my heart. The documentary certainly focuses on Roger's rise to fame and his personal relationships, notably with his various wives, which makes sense given that the film is comprised of a whole load of home movies of Roger goofing around and having fun with a variety of famous friends and his family, and some of this new footage is really cool and really interesting to see, along with the high-profile interviewees. It really does give this particular documentary a very unique feel in and amongst the variety of other available documentaries and programs that you can see about Sir Roger Moore's life. I have to admit that as someone who is, you know, very well immersed in the life and career of Sir Roger Moore, I have to say I was never bored during the experience watching this film, and I've seen it a couple of times now. Both times I found it incredibly entertaining, and I never once felt like, oh god, I'm seeing the same talking heads telling the same stories that I've heard 1,000 times before. The film very much constructs a 3-act narrative out of various aspects of Roger's life. I would say that Act 1 is, you know, his childhood and some of his early relationships and initially being scouted. The inciting incident then is him becoming an actor. The narrative low point at the end end of Act 2 is, interestingly, the poor reception to The Man with the Golden Gun. There's this whole bit where it's like, oh, will Roger's career survive the hit of the poor reception of his second Bond film? But then he goes into his third Bond film, The Spy Who Loved Me, and he's a bit of an underdog. The film portrays him as that, but then he obviously comes out of it with the film as a huge success, and everything is vindicated. Much is made of his self-deprecating nature and his lack of pretension when it came to his craft, despite the fact that he really was quite a fabulous actor. It's a bit strange in that regard that nothing from The Man Who Haunted Himself is shown or touched upon in the film. I appreciate that they only have a limited amount of time to work with, but Moore would often cite that film as being his favourite regarding his own acting and performance. And yeah, he's amazing in that film. You should definitely check it out if you haven't already seen it. I think it's a really wonderful film for Moore fans to go back to. But it is odd not to hear it mentioned at all in the context of the conversations that the documentary is having about Roger's own acting ability. I also felt it a real shame that the film really does brush over most of the post-Spy Who Loved Me years of Roger's life. Like, we get a fair amount on the first 3 Bonds he made and a variety of, Roger's other projects prior to that, like The Saint, of course, and The Persuaders, but after 1977, they kind of just show a bunch of home movies, and then Christopher Walken tells a nice story about spending Christmas with Roger, and they say, oh, well, didn't he have a great life, and they touch on his UNICEF work, and that's kind of it. But then I suppose they're probably saving that for the sequel, where we will presumably dive into the likes of Bullseye, Boat Trip, and Spice World. So let's talk about a couple of the more controversial elements of the documentary that I've seen people talking about. Firstly, the voiceover narration.
Ba 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 bum. Roger Moore.
The voiceover narration is provided by Steve Coogan, who is delivering it in character as Roger Moore, so much of it is delivered from a first-person perspective, and a whole load of narration is, according to the film at least, based on Roger's diaries, memoirs, and interviews. And then a little extra bit of text appears that says loosely, which is... So first of all, I have to say, I'm a huge Steve Coogan fan. I absolutely adore Steve Coogan. I love Alan Partridge, obviously, his most famous character, I would say, but I've seen him in so many other comedy shows. I've seen so much more of his work, and even his more serious dramatic acting. I think he's phenomenal as Stan Laurel in the Stan and Ollie film. Just towards the end of 2024, I actually went to go and see him on stage. He was in a production of Doctor Strangelove, and he was amazing in that. I love the guy. I'm such a big fan, and I know that he was a big fan of Roger Moore, and I've seen a lot of criticism specifically about the impersonation that he does, and people saying that it doesn't actually sound all that much like Roger Moore, really, and yeah, I agree with that. It's not a spot-on impersonation.
Was I a little chubby? Maybe. But when they called me tall, fat, and ugly, that was a little harsh.
At no point do I feel like I'm actually listening to Sir Roger, and they obviously have some archive interviews from Sir Roger in here right next to some of that voiceover narration, so even if you haven't heard Sir Roger's voice in a while, the film is not going to try to pretend. There's a little video at the very start of the documentary of Steve Coogan in the recording studio actually recording the narration. It doesn't try to... There's no smoke and mirrors involved with it. It's very upfront about the device. And that's totally fine with me. I actually prefer it the way that it is. Like, they could have probably found someone who was more of a spot-on impersonation, but I do think that Coogan embellishes the voice with personality and humor. And I was talking to one of my very best friends about this a day or two after Christmas. He'd watched the documentary before I hadn't seen it at that point, and he told me about the voiceover, so I knew that it was coming. And what my friend said was that for the first 5 minutes, he was like slowly reaching for the remote, like, I don't know if I can watch a whole documentary of this. This is a little bit annoying. But then he said that eventually he kind of came around on it, and to be quite honest, I had the same experience with it. By the end of the film, I was appreciative of it. It felt like a tribute, and by taking things from Roger's own writing and having him hear in some form of spirit through the narration, reading his own writing, I thought was a really, really lovely device, actually. The sticking point for a lot of people, myself included, and I've seen other people talking about this, online and heard them in podcasts and what have you, the sticking point is that if you're going to do this, you're going to have this impersonation, you're going to have the narration presented from a first-person perspective as if Roger Moore himself is delivering it, and you're going to say that it is from his own writing. The fact that they add the loosely in there is... it's a little icky, I think, because then suddenly the filmmakers are putting words in Sir Roger's mouth, and it's unclear exactly. The guy wrote so many books, and he was, gave so many interviews and whatever, and there's no, exact citations as to what is, literally lifted from the pages of one of his books and what is, embellished by the filmmakers, the creative license that is taken with them for the sake of constructing the narrative. I understand why that is necessary from a filmmaking perspective, but, as I say, when you are putting words in his mouth, there are just some things that sounded like, I don't think Roger would have ever said that. Like, at one point, there's this little kind of humorous, quip about, in connection with his UNICEF work.
Upside, a chance to do something good. Downside, not a martini in sight.
And that stuck out to me as being something like, would Roger really have said that? Maybe he did. I've not had the time to, sift through every book the man has written. Maybe that is indeed lifted directly from the page of one of his memoirs. But from my own memory of reading those books and seeing him talk about his UNICEF work, he always spoke about it very seriously, and I can't imagine him making a kind of gag like that, the implication be, oh, no martinis around, oh, isn't this very unglamorous sort of thing. It's I don't feel like he would ever say that or have said that. And then there's also another comment made at one point about his fourth wife, for whom he was married to for the final years of his life and indeed up until his death.
Some people may have disapproved of Christina, or Kiki as I called her.
And again, that stuck out to me. Christina isn't actually in the documentary, so we never hear her perspective, and nothing else is really made of, nothing else is made of the point in the documentary that people would ever have disapproved of her. It's a really strange sidebar, I thought. So the other main point of contention that I've seen and heard people discussing is the fact that the film features a love letter written by Sir Roger to his first wife, and excerpts are read by Roger's stepson from that marriage, and it's pretty randy stuff.
How I should like to spank your wonderful, pimply goose flesh bottom.
Whether or not you think it's acceptable, I guess, that letter would be read out and included in the documentary is down to personal taste, I guess. I know that some people have found it quite distasteful. It's quite clearly a private letter, but both parties involved in it have passed away since, so it's not as if it's causing them any kind of personal embarrassment. Does that make it okay to share? I guess it's kind of interesting in the sense that it's, an insight into Roger's personal life in a way that he never thought would be made public. This isn't a situation where he ever probably considered that this would ever be read out in a film that millions of people would be seeing, but I'm not sure that it adds much to proceedings other than just, convey that, the guy could get horny. I guess he'd have loved sexting if he'd have been younger when that became a thing. This may be a bit of a sidebar, but I was slightly amused by the credits state that the film is produced by a production company called Why Now, and funnily enough, why now was the exact thought that ran through my mind when I initially first heard that this documentary was even happening. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, maybe we don't need an excuse to celebrate the great man and his life and career, but I was just curious that the end of 2024, this is when we need the big Roger Moore celebration. It's not as if it's a significant anniversary of the date of his death, or it's not like he would have turned 100 in 2024 or anything. So I found it strange, I suppose, that this documentary would even be made right now. And after watching it, I'm really none the wiser. But then, you know, like I say, maybe we don't need an excuse to celebrate Sir Roger Moore, and maybe that's okay. Maybe we should just be thankful that this thing put Roger Moore on cinema screens again and on TV screens on Christmas Day. And indeed, a big bulk of the documentary focuses on what a great guy Roger Moore was. Famous faces, family and friends painting a picture of a man who was by all accounts a joy to be around and could bring out the best in the people around him. One of the film's central themes is how Roger Moore was a persona, in a way. Roger Moore created Roger Moore, if you will, and this theme runs throughout the documentary, the climax of it seemingly being that Roger Moore essentially made James Bond into Roger Moore, and that was when he found his biggest success as the character, or as the character of himself, Roger Moore, I guess that's the conclusion? I thought this was an enjoyable watch. It's glossy, it's well constructed, it features a great bunch of interviewees, it's by no means the definitive documentary on the life and times of Roger Moore, I don't think, but as another piece charting the man's life and perspectives of him from the people whom he was most close to, I think it's very much worth a fan's time to check out, and I'm never going to complain about the man's memory being kept alive in such a way.
Is there anyone in England that's got that kind of zany, nutty, marvelous kind of humor?
No, not since I left.
It'll forever bother me, though, that the title from the documentary is derived from a play on the title of a Sean Connery Bond film. Like, surely, you know, Live and Let Roger would have been a more appropriate title. The Man with the Golden Roger. The Spy Who Rogered? Roger Raker? For More Eyes Only? More Pussy? A View to a Roger? Anyway, I think it is worth checking out the documentary if you're a fan of Roger Moore. The documentary is supposedly on BBC iPlayer. Here in the UK, at least, it says that it's gonna be on there for over a year, I think, as of time of me making this video, so you've got plenty of time to check it out. I would recommend doing so. I don't really have much of an insight into whether or how it's going to be released in other countries around the world, but if it's on your local TV or a streaming service at some point in the near future, I would recommend checking it out. Let me know your thoughts on the documentary in the comments section below. Were you someone who was really bothered by the voiceover narration, the private letter that was read out at one point? Please do let me know if maybe I was overselling it by saying that this is a controversial point, but I'd love to hear more perspectives on that. Also below are links to my various social media pages. There's also buttons to subscribe and to get notifications for future video uploads, and with all that being said, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.